the author of Global Crossings, Immigration, Civilization, and America. Mr. Vargas Llosa has lectured widely on world economic and political issues, and we're very happy for him to be here tonight. So let's welcome him.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much to America's Future Foundation for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. I thought I would speak for about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more than that, and then just take questions, comments, whatever you want to do, so we can get this going. This is not working. Hello? Can you hear me? No. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think it's working on it. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about a book I just published called Global Crossings. It's about immigration, which is a topic that comes naturally to me, of course. I'm a native of Peru. I have been called a Spaniard in Peru. I spent some time in Britain, where I was called a Pakistani. I then moved to Spain, where I was called a Sudaca, which is a pejorative term for South American. And now I'm in the United States, where I'm called a Hispanic, which means in Spanish, Iberian, from, in other words, from Spain, which is ironic, having been called a South American by Spaniards, and of course a Spaniard by Peruvians. So I perhaps could be forgiven for having an identity problem, so I needed to write this book to take care of that. This book is basically a defense of immigration. So I'm having a very tough time with the conservative bunch in the media these days. I'm trying to persuade them that this is a good thing for them, just as much as for the country. But I'm having a very tough time. So we'll just keep making the case. I think, why did I write this book? I think it's a topic that's laden with myth. Those of us who have been fighting for free trade for long, I think have a reason to think that we have probably won the intellectual case for free trade. I wouldn't say free trade reigns around the world. I would say we're making a lot of progress on that front. But the intellectual case has been won. Nobody says I am against free trade. They find all sorts of excuses undermine free trade, but they never dare say they are against free trade. We have made such a powerful intellectual case for free trade that it has become, I think, pretty much common currency. With immigration, it's a bit more tough, and I think very much that immigration is a missing link in the intellectual case for free trade. So I think we need to make the case for immigration. And right now is not a bad time. As you know, there's this bill in the Senate that's being hotly debated. I don't know if it's going to pass. It's likely that some version of it will pass in the Senate. It will have a much tougher time in the House. And my worry is that it will be amended and amended so many times by the time it passes that it will probably not be all that effective. However, what's out there so far is not bad. It's progress, and I think it's important to push for it. Let me just mention a few of the myths that I think are involved in this topic, and try to respond to them and try to explain why I think there's so much misinformation and misperception in relation to this topic. One very big myth is the idea that this is a different type of immigration. I've heard this so many times. We used to get the right type of immigration, we're getting the wrong type of immigration today. And my answer to that is we always got the wrong type of immigration in the United States. Because every time this became an issue, whether it was in the 19th century, the early 20th century, or now, there was always a significant current of opinion that was opposed to it, and they used exactly the same argument. This is the wrong type of immigration. I would love to have the old type of immigration. It's always been like that. That's exactly why, for instance, in 1924, the first really restrictive law was passed in relation to immigration. It was all about stopping Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans and Southern Europeans from coming into the country, because the United States wanted Northern Europeans and Western Europeans. As you probably know, between 1830 and 1880, it was mostly about Northern Europeans and Western Europeans, of course. And then after that, from 1880 to 1920, it was mostly about Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, who looked very different from the previous waves of immigrants, and this created a huge backlash. Now, of course, we hear how wonderful Italian immigration was, and how wonderful Russian immigration was, and Polish immigration, just as we hear wonderful things about Irish immigration before that, which was also the object of a considerable deal of hostility. We also hear about what a disproportionate number of immigrants the United States is getting today. And that is not true. That's also a myth. The percentage of immigrants is about 13% of the total population. And that's pretty much the same as was the case between 1860 and 1920. For half a century, that was pretty much the proportion. And between 1880 and 1920, it was even higher than that. It was 15%. So it's not true. It's not a disproportionate number of immigrants the United States is getting. It's pretty much the average for the last century and a half. The argument is also made that the United States is getting all the immigrants in the world. Why should we take care of all the immigrants in the world? Why couldn't they go somewhere else? And well, that's not true either. There are, right now, about 3% of the world population is first generation immigrant, only 3%. There are about 215 million immigrants every year. Only 1/6 of that are illegal immigrants. And the United States gets 1/6 of 1% of its population, of its entire population, in terms of illegal immigrants. So it's a much tinier proportion of its overall population. That is the case with many other countries, particularly in Asia, which is the continent that has the greatest number of immigrants. So no, the United States is not getting a disproportionate number of immigrants in relation to other countries in the world. Another myth has to do with motives. People go from that argument, the argument that they're getting too many immigrants, to the argument that they can't possibly take care of all the poor people of the world. Why should the United States bear the responsibility for taking care of world poverty? And although economic conditions are part of the deal, that is not the only motivation behind immigration. There are many places where that's not even an issue. The motives are many. They go from complex conditions at home, having to do more with politics than with the economy, to family ties, to adventure. Parts of the world that are considered highly developed have been net exporters of people until very recently, Europe being one of them. Europe was a net exporter of people until the 1980s. And Germany was exporting about 500,000 people every year until well into the 80s. Certainly that was not something that was linked to extreme poverty in any way. And there are a lot of South Koreans, and that's a wealthy country, who come to the United States still. And yet almost no Bangladeshi women, who are the poorest of the poor in Asia, ever come to the United States or go to Europe, or even migrate within Asia, which again is a part of the world where this is a huge issue. So no, it's not true. There are many other important reasons. In the case of the United States, historical ties having to do with entanglements all over the world. Why do so many Filipinos come to the United States, or have come in the last half century or so? Well, the United States chose to be involved in the Philippines at the end of the 19th century, and ever since there's been a flow of Filipinos to the United States, quite understandably. And there's been a lot of encouragement for that. After the Second World War, the US set up a program specifically for Filipino nurses, so that generated a lot of attraction. The United States invaded the Dominican Republic in 1916, and ever since there's been a flow of Dominicans to the United States, which at various points in recent history was actually encouraged by the United States. Of course, the US presence in Japan at the end of the Second World War was also a trigger for Japanese migration to the United States. There had been previous waves of Japanese immigrants in the country, but that was one specific instance that generated immigration in the United States. So the motives vary, and it is simply not true to say that the economy is the overriding reason. It is a significant one, but it's much more of a mixed picture than that. And incidentally, the poorest of the poor only migrate domestically. That's always the case. The people who migrate overseas or abroad, pretty much everywhere, particularly in Latin America, are not the poorest of the poor. They usually migrate from rural areas to urban centers within the country. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. Another issue that I think needs to be clarified is this. People tend to think that immigrants want to be illegal, that there's some kind of biological predetermination in them that kind of pushes them towards the shadows, that they somehow have it in them that they need to violate US law and they need to subvert the rule of law in this country. And that's not true. Why are there so many illegal immigrants? Well, for the same reason that there are a lot of people operating in the shadows in various trades that the government in this country or anywhere else seeks to criminalize. If you have a disconnect between the law and reality, if there is a social conduct that is significant, in other words, a significant number of people engage in that conduct for some reason, and the law chooses to criminalize that conduct, you inevitably get a black market. It is the natural response of the people to a law that's not realistic. And that is the reason why so many people operate in the shadows today. If you ask any one of those people whether they would prefer to move to a legal condition, I'm sure 99% of them will say yes. Clearly they don't operate in very comfortable conditions. It's simply a response to conditions that push them towards illegality. The law is so absurd that it is contradictory. It completely fails to anticipate the future every time that it tries. There are so many examples. I have a chapter about this, and there are a lot of very funny examples. I mean, there's a thing called the Texas Proviso that made it legal to hire an illegal immigrant for 30 years and yet illegal to bring him or her into your house for a drink of water. In 1965, for instance, they decided, well, we're going to change this law from 1924 that I mentioned that law in 1924 was basically a law against Central and Eastern Europeans. They wanted to go back to Northern and Western Europeans, so they established this national origin quota. So in 1965, they said, well, this is almost racist. I mean, this is something that in this day and age is not tolerable. So we need to change this. So they decided to do away with national origin quotas, and they replaced them with hemisphere-wide quotas. Of course, little did they know that they were opening the gates to millions of Latin Americans and Asians. They had no idea that was going to be the consequence. If you go back to the speeches that were made in Congress at the time, it was fascinating. Nobody anticipated that Latin Americans and Asians would come by the millions. And of course, that's exactly what happened. They talked about family reunification as something that would have very little effect. And yet that has been one of the driving forces behind immigration in the last few decades. I'm just trying to tell you, I'm not even making a judgment on those issues. I'm simply trying to tell you what has happened over the years with lawmakers trying to anticipate the future and being completely unable to do so, because they were a lot more interested in establishing barriers and not listening or not heeding the signals from the real world and the market. And so that is exactly what happened. For instance, between the 1940s and the 1960s, that was one of the few periods in I guess, contemporary US history in which the law was kind of realistic. They had this guest worker program, which was very flexible and open, called the bracero, which was mostly agricultural. At the time, those were mostly the kinds of immigrants the U.S. economy needed, and mostly the kinds of immigrants who wanted to come here. And it worked very well. There were aspects of it that were questionable, kind of chauvinistic aspects, but by and large, it was a very effective program. And there was very little illegal immigration in those 2 decades. It was something that everybody missed. I mean, when they started in 1965, or even a year earlier than that, discussing a change in the law, they didn't take into account this very recent experience, which was a very successful one, the bracero program. So they got rid of the program, and what was the effect of that? Well, in the next few decades, of course, the United States got a lot of illegal immigrants, something that had not happened in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So again, this disconnect between the law and reality is really what creates conditions for illegality. It is not something that's so much a choice on the part of people who come here as a condition that is generated by the law itself. Another myth that is very widespread has to do with culture. And I mentioned before this idea, this notion that we're getting the wrong kinds of immigrants nowadays. So once you explain to them that this was always the case, they still come back at you and they say, well, but those previous waves of immigrants clearly were compatible with the U.S., with U.S. society, because eventually they made it. They became part of U.S. society. But the culture of these people is so different. I mean, there's no way they're going to fit in. And yet, any way you look at it, they are completely in tune with U.S. society. If you look at religion, which is something that people are very concerned about, if we take just Hispanics in the last 2 decades, 70% of Hispanic immigrants were Catholic or are Catholic. 23% are Protestant, and of that 70% of Catholics, 1/5 declare themselves to be born again, which is something that Catholics in Latin America never claim. So they must be claiming this because they think this is something that will connect with Protestants in the United States. Family values. Many of the people who object to immigration are people who are champions of family values. Well, they need to pay attention to family values among immigrants. half of all illegal households are made up of couples with children. And only 13% of illegal households, 13%, are headed by a single parent, against 1/3 in the case of native-born Americans, native-born households. It's also the case that immigrants are at least as entrepreneurial as native-born Americans. That's another argument that's made. These people don't know how to create companies, how to create wealth. They don't have this entrepreneurial spirit that previous waves of immigrants used to have. Well, one way to look at it is to measure the rate of self-employment among them, and it's exactly the same as the native population. Is about 12%. And so on and so forth. I mean, whatever way you look at it, I mean, you look at gentrification, the process of regenerating, resurrecting neglected neighborhoods. I give a number of examples in the book, in Florida, in New York, and you name it. Immigrants are always involved. They're very interested in regenerating these neighborhoods. I will grant you this. I mean, the process has been somewhat distorted by multiculturalism. As you are probably aware, in the 1960s, the developed world, the Western world, adopted this new paradigm that I guess was really a child of the war and of decolonization following the war. The idea was to take a second look at other cultures and other nations, and from there sprang a sort of sentiment of guilt that translated into relativism. The idea was that all values were equal, or all societies produce values that were equal. Our values are not necessarily better than theirs, and this was kind of linked to the idea that Western values were really values of domination. So you had this whole intellectual current in academia that wanted to deconstruct, that was the word that was very much in vogue at the time, to deconstruct Western values so that you could show that behind them was really the power of domination, the power of exploitation. So of course this eventually translated into policy. And if you start looking at minorities as people who are victims, then of course you're going to engage in social engineering based on ethnicity. So that translated into many other things, from gerrymandering based on ethnicity to equal employment opportunity to, whatever, positive discrimination. And so that was eventually bound to create a backlash. I mean, people, native-born Americans, were going to look at this and think, well, not only do they come here, but they also get privileges because, we exploited them, but I never exploited anyone. Maybe my, great-great-great-great-grandparents exploited them, but why should I have to pay for this? So this generated a lot of bad blood and a backlash. And I think there's something to be said for that. I have a chapter in the book about multiculturalism. I am very critical of it. And I also have kind words for something that was called Americanization. Before multiculturalism, there was something called Americanization. And that was not so much government policy as a general attitude throughout society that created a climate that facilitated assimilation. People were encouraged to learn English. People wanted to learn English. It was something that was really very much part of society, wherever it was. In school, at work. Everywhere you went, it was part of U.S. society. That, of course, changed after in the second half of the 20th century, and multiculturalism has a lot to do with that. But I think there's something to be said for the fact that Americanization was helpful in integrating immigrants into U.S. society. But even so, even though that was lost, and even though multiculturalism created these pockets of, protection in terms of minorities and particularly immigrants. Even so, assimilation has been taking place pretty much along the same lines that it used to take place in the past, at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And this is something very interesting as well, because that's another myth, the myth that these immigrants are not assimilated. The pattern is exactly the same pattern as in the past. It's a three-generation pattern. The first generation comes in, they make some progress, 40% of them speak reasonable English. They obviously are very, very eager to fit in. They're very conscious of the fact that they are seen as outsiders. And they make some progress. The second generation is bilingual, but they speak English better than their mother tongue, as it were. And the third generation speaks only English. By the third generation, the other language has been lost completely. The second generation does much better financially than the first generation, and by the third generation, they are exactly on a par with the rest of US society. And that was always the case. I checked, for instance, the rate of out-marriage, in other words, marrying beyond your national group. And I compared Mexicans today and Hispanics in general with Italians, second generation Mexicans, second generation Hispanics, with second generation Italians in the early part of the 20th century, the 20s to 30s. The rate of out-marriage among the second generation Italians was 17%, with Mexicans and Hispanics it's about 20%, so it's even higher, even though it's easier today for a Mexican or a Hispanic to marry another Mexican or Hispanic than it was for an Italian back then. But it's a similar rate, and by the third generation, the rate of out-marriage is just very, very strong. Whatever way you look at it, you look at, well, this is another argument that's made, well, they're never going to assimilate because they have too many children. The rate of birth is just too high. And then they tell you that the immigrants are going to destroy the welfare system, which is, I guess, contradictory with this claim. But it's not true. Among of all the different immigrant groups, the group that is having the greatest number of children are basically Hispanics. But that's only 60% higher than native-born Americans. It used to be a much greater difference. So what's happening is the rate is declining significantly. And that echoes what is happening across the countries where they came from, Latin America, where the birth rate is just declining at a tremendous pace. And that is reflected as mirrored in the United States. And I anticipate that fairly soon the rate will be exactly the same as for native-born Americans. Let me just mention a couple of things about on the economy and the welfare state, and maybe we can open this to questions. The economic argument for immigration is a very strong one, and yet this is still something that people don't really accept that easily. Both at the upper end of the scale and the lower end of the scale, high-skilled or low-skilled immigrants. What immigrants do is they make the economy larger, they make it bigger, they enlarge the pie, as it were. I looked at some of the most respected critics of immigration. One of them is from Harvard. His name is George Borges, and even he accepts that immigrants make a contribution to the economy. His calculation is that it amounts to about $22 billion a year. So what we did is we went and updated that number, because he came up with this a few years ago. And that will translate into $36 billion today. So if we legalize them, this would be multiplied by 2.5, 3 times maybe. So we're talking about $100 billion a year, about $1 trillion over a decade. So it's a pretty significant contribution, and that's by a very conservative in the sense that he's very reluctant to concede anything to immigrants. I think it's probably much bigger than that, but even if it was only $1 trillion per decade, I mean, that is significant enough. Of course, immigrants are both consumers and producer, so you always have to take that into account. Yes, low-skilled immigrants come and take jobs that don't have too many native takers. What happens when they do? Well, native workers move up the scale and they earn better wages. Do immigrants impact wages at the lower end? A tiny little bit. Our calculation is about 1.5%. It's very tiny. But that's offset by the rise in the wages earned by people who move up the scale because of this dynamic. And the net effect is about a plus 1.8%. Not only that, but immigrants help keep those services, of course, at the lower end of the scale more affordable. They hold down the prices, which means everybody, as consumers across society, benefits from that. They make these labor-intensive industries a lot more productive, which of course translates into greater productivity across the economy. At the other end of the scale, high-skilled immigrants, they make a colossal contribution. If you think about it, about 1/4 of Nobel Prize winners in the 20th century in the United States were immigrant. About 1/3 of doctorates in science, technology, you name it, are or were immigrant. Immigrants created a bunch of companies between 1995 and 2005. They created between 500,000 and 750,000 jobs just by starting high-tech companies. So clearly they're making a huge contribution, and yet the law was so absurd that the quota for high-skilled immigrants would be exhausted on day one. In other words, as soon as it was open for applications, the quota would be exhausted. So clearly there was a huge demand from high-tech companies in the United States for these high-skilled immigrants, and yet the law just wouldn't allow them in. So that's something that generated, I think, a lot of problems, and they're trying to take care of that now in this bill. I mean, I think the ceiling they've established is still a little unrealistic, but clearly they're now beginning to understand that this is something that hurts the U.S. economy quite significantly. So let me make one more point about the welfare state, because this is another important argument. So even if they accept that the contribution to the economy is a positive one, then critics say, well, in the short run, it's going to be very tough on us because of the fiscal impact. They take a lot more money out than they bring in, so clearly this is going to eventually be paid by us, by the native-born population. And again, this is not true. First of all, it's important to understand that illegal immigrants already pay taxes. They pay a lot of taxes. They pay local taxes, state taxes, even social security taxes because of fraud. The government estimates that they pay about $7 billion a year in social security taxes. And they pay, of course, at the local level, gas, real estate taxes, all these taxes they pay. There have been a number of very interesting studies. One was made by Jeffrey Basel between, what he did is he took immigration between 1970 and the 1990s. And he came up with an interesting figure. He claims that immigrants contributed $25 billion more than they took out of the transfer system in the United States. Other researchers have come up with different numbers. Perhaps the one that's kind of more widely respected because it's very neutral and it's ideologically very neutral as well. The National Research Council a few years ago did a very, very important study, an in-depth study of this. And then what they did is they calculated everything. They included the next 50 years because, of course, immigrants are mostly young, so we can expect that they will be, for the most part, working for the next 50 years or so. So if you're going to take into account what they contribute and what they take out, you need to take into account the next 50 years. They also take into account the fact that those children who are currently in the public school system are eventually going to come out of school and begin to work. So you're going to kind of factor in what they're costing U.S. taxpayers today because they go to public schools, and it's probably fair to also factor in what they're going to contribute once they come out of school and work. So they took all of that into account, and they came up with a figure once it was updated, because it's been updated several times, which is basically this. An immigrant costs about $5,000. That's the net present value of the next 50 years worth of contributions and benefits. So $5,000 is a one-off payment, which is really tiny if you balance that out against what they contribute to the economy, because they didn't take that into account. What the general contribution in terms of productivity to the overall economy. So the net effect is going to be, I mean, by definition, a positive one. And ultimately, I mean, if you're really worried about the welfare state, I think you need to ask yourself, who is responsible for the explosion of government spending and the welfare state in the United States in the last century? Clearly, immigrants are not to blame for the fact that government spending has gone up by a factor of 50 in the last century. Until the Second World War, they weren't even entitled to any relief programs at all. And even today, after the welfare reform of the 1990s, they have very limited access to welfare transfers. And even if you count things like Medicare, for instance, what they take out of the system is a much smaller number than what natives take out. Why? Because they're much younger. I mean, if you're really worried about the future of the welfare state, you need to take into account the fact that the average age for immigrants, illegal immigrants right now, who would become legal if the bill passes, is 27 against 42 for the native population. So if you're really worried about the rate of contributions to benefits, then again, immigrants are going to help maintain the welfare state going for just a tiny bit longer, because I think it's bankrupt anyway. But I'm just trying to show you that this is not really a very substantial argument. So let me leave it at that. I mean, I just want to, I wanted to give you a very just rough idea of some of the issues and topics that I discussed in the book, with some of the arguments that I made. Ultimately, the United States and just the developed world in general is going to have to come to grips with immigration, because I think they have no choice. If you think about it, free trade has made substantial progress in the last few decades, so much so that trade now amounts to about the equivalent of 45% of world GDP. It's a pretty significant proportion. The flow of capital across borders is also pretty significant. About 20% of all of the world's savings are invested outside of the country in which they originate. And yet, as I mentioned at the beginning, only 3% of the world population is first-generation immigrants. So there's a kind of imbalance there that obviously has to do with the barriers that exist. And I think that as time goes by, unless there is a complete reversal of these trends away from free trade, away from the free flow of capital across borders, the natural tendency is for immigration, for the free circulation of people, to be very much a part of that dynamic. So at this point, it's really a choice between trying to impede it, in which case you're going to hurt yourself, or generating a legal and institutional climate for this to happen within the law and safely, and make that a contribution that will be to everybody else's benefit. So let me leave it at that, and perhaps I can take some questions. Thank you. No, we don't, and when we get immigrants, I will make the case for open borders in Peru.
All right. Now I have a couple of things to say.
Yeah.
I think I agree with free trade, and I agree with what you're saying. The flaw in your presentation that I see is that we have an out-of-control government. Therefore, with that, there's no guarantee that we will not have immigrants that come in, that are here now, that are not draining on our welfare system, and will drain on it even more. Our government just, our IRS just returned millions of dollars of money to one address in Atlanta because of overpayment of taxes, which, in other words, it's not your idea that's bad. It's we have a government that is out of control and cannot handle or take care of things properly.
I totally agree.
Including
It's-
our welfare system.
Yeah, and not only,
Medicare and everything.
yeah.
School system, everything is out of control. So putting the burden of immigrants come in now, illegally in particular, because they're the ones that seem to be low-paying wages and so on, is only going to add to the complication. They'll become the scapegoat too, which is not good. So,
I respectfully disagree. I think that the problem you have with the U.S. government is a very legitimate one. It's almost self-evident. Anywhere you look, it's very apparent that the government is in a total crisis. It's inefficient, it's corrupt, it's too big, it's unable to handle its duties in the way it should. But my argument is, don't blame immigrants for that. And immigrants will not make that worse. They will have a beneficial effect on the economy, and they will have a beneficial effect, at least in the short term benefit, because the age is so young at this point that they will be a very light burden on that system, and yet they will contribute a lot into that system from the very beginning. Of course, they contribute a little bit now, but being an illegal, undocumented immigrant makes it very hard to contribute more. So, as I mentioned, they contribute through, real estate taxes, fraud at social security level, or whatever. Once they become legal, they contribute just as anybody else. But because they're going to be working for a lot longer, and they're not going to be making claims on Medicare for decades to come, they're going to help in the short run correct that imbalance. What's going to happen, 3-4 decades from now? By the time they become old and they become a drain on the system, well, by that time you will have another wave of young immigrants, probably, if the system is corrected at this point, another wave of immigrants helping to support those people who will by then be old. However, I don't think the U.S. government will look the way it does today, 3-4 decades from now, because it's a system that's simply about to explode. I think we're going to see major reform of the U.S. government in the next few decades. And ultimately, if that's the issue, get rid of the welfare state. Make the welfare state either a lot smaller or just non-existent. But why deprive yourselves of the benefit of having immigrants for the sake of keeping alive a system that is not worth keeping alive? Yeah.
I have a question. In regards to your book, do you state anything about the progression of becoming a U.S. citizen, of immigrants becoming a U.S. citizen, starting in, 1920, in comparison to currently? Because my father is he came into the country in the 1970s, and I think in about, I'll say 2008, he tried to obtain the citizenship. Well, he tried to obtain citizenship a number of times in the 21st century and 2000s. and he had a difficult time obtaining it. He passed the test but was denied numerous times. And I was wondering what was the comparison between back then comparison to now.
Back then it was not an issue because you were entitled to become a citizen fairly quickly. This only became an issue after the 1960s. And today there's a huge discussion about that. Some people, I'm talking about the bill in the Senate, some people say we shouldn't allow them to become citizens. We may accept the fact that they're already here. We're not going to kick them out. You know, we're never going to see on CNN 12 million people marching down the border. It's just not going to happen. So we might as well just accept the fact that they will remain. But let's not reward them for what they did. So let's not allow them to become citizens. There's one kind of current of opinion that states that. Others say, well, it's absurd. I mean, you can't have, you know, two classes of citizens. So if they remain here, then they eventually have to become citizens. So what they're proposing is a gradual system. Currently, and this could be amended, but currently the situation is this. Illegal immigrants will get a temporary permit for 6 years, renewable for another 6. And after that, they will be able to apply for a green card, but not for citizenship. However, if they get a green card, then by definition they are allowed to apply for citizenship a few years later, because a green card kind of entitles you to apply for citizenship. Unless they change that, and nobody's really at this point proposing to do that, that will be the case. So it will be a very long process. I mean, 6 years plus 6 years plus whatever time it takes for you to get a green card, let's say 1-2 years. And after that, if the current law is maintained, another 5 years before you become a citizen. Unless they change that, we're talking about, what, 17, 18, almost 20 years before you become a citizen. So it's a very slow, gradual process. Yeah.
I think my biggest concern, being an immigrant as well, my biggest is that we no longer have the melting pot that America used to be. So we have all these pockets, little Korea, little Vietnam, little China, little whatever it is, and you don't have that sense of civic obligation that we should have here. And from that, I'm seeing a lot of immigrants come here for a better life. They come here because they don't find what they have in their own country, the spirit of entrepreneurship, the liberation, the liberty, the government, the protections that we have here. And yet, it seems like so many of the immigrant population is latching on to the ideas of the left, which grows government. So how do we combat that losing battle as far as the civic obligation, as far as the melting pot, the Americanization, coming back to that instead of this idea of diversity and multiculturalism and pockets of entitlement?
Well, that's a great question. Immigrants are not even remotely to blame for that. It's US academics and European academics. I mean, this is a new paradigm that emerged in the last 50 years. It became very powerful, eventually translated into policy, and just a general outlook. It's something that's taught at school, so it's really kind of percolating throughout society and the generations. And yes, it has become very powerful, and I agree. That's something that I think is a distortion of the idea of respecting minorities. It goes, well beyond that. However, it's something that really originated in academia, and it's something that is a lot more linked to values and attitudes in developed countries than to the people who come into those countries. So that's really a challenge for US society, for US academia, for US policy, rather than for immigrants themselves. However, what I did is I looked at, I just asked myself, is this, which is definitely an issue, is this translating into a very different pattern of assimilation than in the past? Because for me that was key. If that was the case, then clearly we have a problem. And yet, it's just not true. It's not happening. You may think it's happening because, of course, if you go past a certain neighborhood where there happen to be a number of first-generation immigrants, then clearly that's going to be the effect. But I looked at what was happening in the early part of the 20th century, and even in the 19th century, and it was exactly the same. In the 19th century, you had these German neighborhoods in the Midwest. They printed their newspapers in German. They spoke to themselves in German, among themselves in German. They spoke to their children in German. They pushed for school to adopt German as a second language and even as a first language. The same happened with Italians. Italians had these Italian communities in the early part of the 20th century. They printed their newspapers. I read newspapers from the 1920s and 1930s, and what they were saying about Italian communities is so much like what is said about, say, Spanish-speaking communities today. This sense of pockets, little islands, kind of spread out throughout the country that made it impossible for the melting pot to continue. And yet, by the second generation, that was gone. The second generation looks at it very differently. So I compared second generations today and in the past, and the process is very much the same. And I found out also that they're replicating something else that's also very interesting, which is the fact that in the third generation, because they feel so secure, they are so assimilated, they are so much part of society, that they don't have this complex anymore of being different or being looked at as if they were different. They begin to rescue all roots, but on a purely sentimental level. It doesn't really mean much more than that. So they begin to, just as the second generation really moved away from those roots because they really wanted to fit in and they were very conscious of the fact that they were seen as being different, the third generation reclaims those roots and they begin to celebrate some national holidays. And that's how the Irish and the Italians, began to celebrate these holidays that now have become part of the melting pot. You all know what Cinco de Mayo is, of course. Cinco de Mayo is not celebrated, or didn't used to be celebrated in Mexico. It's an invention of Mexicans in the United States, third-generation Mexicans in the United States, who felt so secure in their assimilation that they began to rescue these traditions. But yet they were traditions that were maybe traditions from tiny little, provinces in Mexico. They were not national traditions. And so Mexicans in Mexico back home started looking at this and saying, well, this is crazy. Mexicans who migrated from Mexico to the United States have turned Cinco de Mayo into this huge national celebration that we don't even celebrate here at home. So they began to celebrate Cinco de Mayo just because it was embarrassing for them. So that's just one little instance of how these are expressions of the melting pot. The melting pot was always about that. It was not about renouncing roots, it's about assimilating, and once you were assimilated into US society, reclaiming those roots, so that the US really looked like a microcosm of the world. Which is why people who have written about this extensively make a point that I think is very important. Unlike many other countries in the world, the US nation is really not based on blood, it's based on credo. It's a set of values and a set of ideas, open enough and flexible enough that almost everybody fits in there. So that's why assimilation has been always much more profound in this country than it has in some European countries, where the idea of nationhood was very much based on blood rather than credo, and so it was much harder for people to fit in.
How do you think the war on drugs has affected immigration?
What a great question. In the case specifically of Mexican immigration into the United States, that's a big issue. Because people who mistrust Mexicans coming into the United States always tend to relate those flows of people with the flow of drugs and criminality in general. I traveled extensively across the border. I also traveled in Europe and in Northern Africa. I wanted to see how they compare. And it was very troubling to see that some of the entry points into the United States. Most of them are now in Arizona. They used to be in other parts of the border. Are controlled by drug traffickers. And what they do is they don't really partake in the business. They just simply control those routes, and they just give, I guess, the rite of passage to immigrants coming in. But because they are interconnected, of course, law enforcement is always suspicious of the fact that the drug trade is involved, that drug traffickers are benefiting from this, and that some of the people coming in may be part of the drug traffic. So it is creating problems. But ultimately, the overwhelming majority of immigrants have really nothing to do with the drug traffic, and they are in many ways victims of this.
I agree with you that most of the immigrants, particularly illegals, come in and do the entry-level jobs. They do the jobs that Native American citizens don't want to do. I agree with that. They work really hard. But I want you to activate your statement that as they do these jobs, that other people move up. What seems to me to happen, or is happening because of the welfare state, the people that would normally be doing those jobs just go on welfare and never move off welfare. Or they stand on welfare and never come into the working economy. So what do you base your conclusion?
Yeah, I looked at all the figures in terms of course unemployment, because that's one possibility that they become unemployed. Whether they go into welfare, whether they move out of the state, in any state we're talking about, that could be an effect of this. Or whether they just remove themselves from the labor market altogether, as has happened in the last few years because of the recession. What has happened, of course, is we know that a lot of people, I mean, for a number of years have been telling us that unemployment has been going down, but really what's been happening is people have been removing themselves from the labor market. And no, I mean, that's not what's happening. Look at it this way, I mean, in general, you would have, if that was happening, you would either have higher unemployment levels or higher numbers of people removing themselves from the labor market in those places where the impact of immigration was greater. I looked at Arizona, for instance. 10% of the workforce is immigrants, so that's clearly one state where some of this would be reflected if it was happening. And yet, out-migration was not very big. And unemployment, just before the bursting of the bubble, so 2006, 2007, unemployment was either 4% or below 4%. So we're talking about full employment, basically. And there was upward mobility. People who had been in very low-paying jobs for 5 years, 6 years, tended to move up, just as the labor force tended to get a lot of immigrant workers. If you think about it, it's really very much, it's the same as what happens domestically. I mean, if you forget about immigrants for a moment, the dynamics domestically are very much, are very similar. Since the end of the Second World War, about 100 million baby boomers and women have joined the workforce. So it's a huge influx of people. And you would think, well, 100 million people joining the workforce, that's going to cause major disruptions. Some of them are, low skilled, some of them not very educated, others educated, but there's only so many educated jobs to go around. And yet, there's never been significant long-term unemployment in the United States, only in times of recession, such as these. But generally, that has not created long-term unemployment of any kind. People come in, they take jobs that others no longer take, those others move up, then eventually those who took the jobs at the low end move up as well, others come in. Everybody continually moves in such a way that this kind of process renews itself all the time. Which is why you need kind of immigration to be pretty much constant, because eventually the people, immigrants who've been here for 10, 15 years, working, in low-paying jobs, in many ways are acquiring skills that would, in different conditions, allow them to move up. And if that doesn't happen, then the economy is getting hurt. I mean, at least getting hurt in the sense that it's not making full use of the capabilities of these people. So you need this process of constant mobility that only a constant renewal of the workforce can really produce.
Okay, so you're not saying that the immigrants that come in and take the low-paying jobs are pushing the other people up. You're saying these other people that have worked in these low-paying jobs have gotten the skills so that they will move up anyway, and now they're just filling the void with those people. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And remember, if you're going to get managerial jobs, you need people to manage. So you need people underneath to be there for you to manage them. And that's only going to happen if you continue to kind of grow the workforce.
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
Just a follow-up to the question on Americanization. In your book, you speak for Americanization against multiculturalism. The latter has been observed, say, in Canada. Is there empirical evidence that Americanization or organization works better than multiculturalism?
Yeah, what I mean is, it really depends what you mean by multiculturalism. What I mean by multiculturalism is really collectivism. It's a way of looking at people not as individuals, but as collective entities that sometimes are called minorities, that deserve special attention and a privilege, some form of privilege in society. Sometimes that's translated into public policy, sometimes it's not public policy, but just general attitudes. But that, I think, has led to the sense that there are these pockets of people who are simply not assimilating. I think it's also creating a backlash. It's feeding into this notion that immigrants today are very different from what they were in the past, and therefore this poses a danger culturally or even existentially to the nation. Something that I don't believe is true, but it's something that's very powerful in people's minds at this point. Americanization it had some problems because there were some chauvinistic aspects, there were some abuses that were reported at the time. I mean, people could come up with stories like this. I don't want to give the impression that it was ideal, but it was certainly it was a much better system, I think, because it made Native Americans or people born in the United States much more proud of their own role in helping immigrants assimilate. Whether you were a manager at a corporation and you were helping your workers assimilate, or a teacher in public school or whatever, or a journalist. I mean, the media was very much part of this. I mean, there was a whole cultural attitude. You involved almost the whole population in this process. And that had one very significant effect, which was to reduce fear, because I think fear has a lot to do with this. I mean, it's perfectly normal, not just in the United States, everywhere. I've seen it in my own native country, I've seen it everywhere. People fear that which they don't really know. Any community that is suddenly confronted with an influx of people, outsiders and newcomers, is going to be afraid. So this process that involved the population, and it's a two-way street because of course it involved immigrants themselves, I think helped reduce fear at that time. And the current multicultural climate, I think, doesn't help reduce that fear.